My grandmother was Alice Ski, the first woman filmmaker in the world. You never heard of her? I can hardly blame you. For years, I myself thought that she was an ordinary grandmother. She had a cloud of white hair and wore funny hats and had soft, soft hands that I loved to stroke. I had no idea back then that this frail old woman had been one of the leading lights of her era, with an exceptional destiny. Grandmother was present at the birth of the cinema. She saw still pictures come to life. In fact, her youthful smile was immortalized in the very first moving pictures. Years later, another invention, television, captured her image and her voice.
Et vous ne m'avez pas maquillée, d'habitude on me maquille, toujours.
Mais vous êtes très belle comme ça.
Her story began more than a century ago in France. She was born on the 1st of July, 1873, in Saint-Mandé, near Paris. She spent a happy childhood in Chile, where her father was a bookseller, until he lost everything and had to move the family back to Europe. In her late teens, with her father and brother dead, and her sisters married, she found herself alone to care for her aging mother.
Adrian, I found some more.
Oh, yeah. I also found something.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. What is this?
Oh, it's the decoration. I don't know what this is, whether those are diamonds or garnets, at the lovely little purple ribbon. Mommy always wore the purple ribbon in her lapel. Maybe you remember. Not this one, but a little one of the same color.
Oh, yeah?
Yes.
I don't remember. I see this picture here also of her.
Oh, yeah.
When was this taken?
Oh, she's so young there.
Yeah.
That was in Paris.
J'avais un ami et ça a été, je dois dire, mon premier amour. Mais il avait 75 ans.
Quel âge aviez-vous?
J'avais 18 ans. Oh, je l'aurais épousé volontiers. J'adorais cet homme. Alors, il dit à ma mère, je crois que la meilleure chose pour Alice, ce serait d'apprendre la scénodactylographie. C'est une chose nouvelle. Elle peut être secrétaire dans une maison, etc. Et en effet, j'ai appris assez vite. Et j'avais comme professeur le sténographe de la Chambre des députés. Et il m'avait, je ne dirais pas vu à part, mais enfin, il m'aimait bien et il m'a dit la première bonne place sera pour vous. Enfin, il m'envoie un mot pour me dire qu'il y avait une très bonne place à la société de photographie, qui n'était pas à Gaumont à ce moment-là. Je suis arrivée cœur battant pour me présenter là dans cette place. Et on m'a dit, ah, c'est dommage, mais M. Richard n'est pas là. Alors, quand la personne qui m'a reçu a vu ma déception, elle m'a dit, mais vous pourriez peut-être voir Gaumont, c'est son fondé de pouvoir. Il n'était pas à ce moment-là le chef de la maison. Il m'a dit, oh, votre recommandation est excellente, mademoiselle, mais la place est importante et j'ai peur que vous soyez bien jeune. Alors, je lui ai dit, oh, mais monsieur, ça me passera. En effet, là, ça vous passera.
She was thrilled with her new job. She was young, and life spread before her, filled with promise.
J'étais à ce moment-là secrétaire de la maison Gaumont et Demény, qui, comme vous le savez, est un des précurseurs, est arrivé à la maison présentant un appareil. Et Gaumont, qui était un homme de science, a tout de suite reconnu la valeur de cette invention et il a mis en marche une fabrication. Malheureusement, pendant que nous faisions ces préparatifs, les frères Lumière sont venus nous faire une visite. C'était eux-mêmes des amis de la maison. Et j'étais dans le bureau, et par courtoisie, ils m'ont invité eux-mêmes à assister à cette séance. Et nous sommes allés à une société qui était, je crois, la société d'encouragement aux sciences. Et là, nous avons trouvé les Lumières qui avaient tendu un drap et qui tournaient un petit appareil. Et nous avons vu sortir ce que vous connaissez, qui est classique, c'est-à-dire les sorties de leurs ateliers. Nous sommes revenus enthousiasmés de l'invention, mais très déconfits, puisque déjà le cinéma de Mény était en route. Mais enfin, on a continué les essais, on a cherché, et très vite, Gaumont a trouvé un appareil projecteur, car enfin la grande invention, c'est la projection, n'est-ce pas? Et à ce moment-là, on continuait à prendre dans les rues des scènes de rue, des petites choses arrivées en gare, etc. Et moi, j'étais fille de libraire. Et j'adorais la lecture, j'avais beaucoup lu, j'avais fait un petit peu de théâtre d'amateur. Et enfin, il me semblait qu'on pouvait faire mieux. Et j'ai proposé à M. Gaumont de faire quelques scènes de cinéma. Il m'a dit, oui, c'est une affaire de jeune fille, en effet. Eh bien, mon Dieu, vous pouvez essayer, mais à une condition, c'est que votre courrier n'en souffre pas.
C'était des scénarios que vous écriviez vous-même?
Ah oui, c'était même pas des scénarios à ce moment-là, c'était des petites histoires que je fabriquais comme ça, n'est-ce pas?
Et quelles étaient ces histoires?
L'affaire aux choux, c'est l'histoire de deux amoureux qui ont envie d'avoir des enfants. Et nous avions mis des choux en carton. Et nous avions mis des poupons en bois, sauf un. Et la maman était très inquiète. Les amoureux trouvaient ça derrière le chou, vous voyez, c'était pas terrible. Non. Mais j'en ai fait d'autres qui ont eu, parfois, plus de succès que je ne pensais. J'ai fait la Esmeralda, j'ai fait... oh mon Dieu, j'ai la liste de mes films là-haut. Je vous en donnerai une si vous voulez.
Grandmother said they were able to sell 80 copies of her first film, La Fée aux Choux, or The Cabbage Fairy. Her boss, Leon Gaumont, pleased with this success and no doubt happy to be able to save a salary, appointed my grandmother head of all moving picture production at the House of Gaumont, while keeping her as a secretary and a girl Friday. But as time went on, she became less of a secretary and more of a filmmaker. At that time, neither the title nor the trade of filmmaker existed.
Alors Léon Gaumont, qui est-ce? Il est à peine plus âgé qu'elle, il a 9 ans de plus qu'elle. Et c'est un ingénieur, un visionnaire, il va voir avant tout le monde le son, l'image coloriée, qui seront d'abord des scènes au pochoir et ensuite un procédé nouveau, le trichrome, le plus grand cinéma du monde, le Gaumont Palace, et enfin un spectacle complet avec les actualités. Alice Guy, que lui apporte-t-elle? Son enthousiasme, son dynamisme. Pour la première fois au monde, un film va être écrit, produit, réalisé par la même personne. Et 70 ans avant que n'existe la nouvelle vague, eh bien, avant que le mot n'existe, nous avons du cinéma d'auteur. Elle va utiliser ces procédés que sont la couleur, le son, qu'a mis au point Léon Gaumont pour en faire des films qui nous restent aujourd'hui.
Bonjour, dites-moi, Rosine, ma belle voisine, d'où venez donc tout ce bruit chez vous cette nuit? Vous battiez-vous, ma charmante, étiez-vous souffrante? Je vous entendais gémir, je n'ai pas pu dormir.
Au fond, Gaumont est fondé sur un couple, comme sont nés tous les enfants du monde. Lui, l'ingénieur, l'esprit de géométrie, elle, celle qui a lu, celle qui a créé, l'esprit de finesse. Voilà comment on crée une grande société.
Voulez aux instances de thé, le galant va clocher. Vous vous apprêtez à me dire des choses cruautés. Voulez aux instances de thé, puis ajoutant ses pâtés. Maintenant, comme c'est mon vieux, c'est dans ta gueule, ça vaudra mieux.
Alice directed over 100 of these forerunners of the music video between 1900 and 1907, nearly 30 years before Hollywood got around to introducing the talkies at the end of the 20s. She found the creative and technical challenges offered by moving pictures tremendously stimulating. But there were obstacles. As she wrote in her autobiography, I had been left to work everything out by myself in the beginning, to break new ground. But as soon as my department became profitable, there was an attempt to push me aside. However, I defended my position, and thanks to the support of the chairman, Monsieur Eiffel, who always encouraged me with kindness, the board of directors acknowledged my efforts and unanimously decided to leave me in charge.
Les ingénieurs qui étaient avec moi, qui travaillaient au studio, ont toujours été très gentils. Mais j'avais un directeur des ateliers, qui s'appelait Decaux. Et ça, nous n'étions pas bien ensemble du tout. Tellement peu ensemble, mais ça, je ne désire pas que ce soit publié, je vous dis ça. Quand j'ai fait Ma Passion, qui a été mon plus grand film en France, j'ai fait La Passion et j'avais un décorateur ménessier qui était excellent. Une nuit d'hiver, il faisait très froid, c'est vrai. Decaux est monté dans l'atelier, il a pris tous nos décors faits, il les a fait couper pour chauffer. C'est vous dire à quel point.
Her greatest success in France was her film of the life and passion of Christ. It was a very long film for 1906, 35 minutes. There were 25 different sets and hundreds of extras. It made a tremendous impression when it was released, and even today, certain aspects of the film stand out as extraordinary.
J'ai une véritable passion pour la Passion d'Alice Guy. Plusieurs sociétés de production ont d'ailleurs produit leur propre Passion, et celle d'Alice Guy se distingue de l'ensemble de cette production, notamment par sa mise en scène. En fait, il faut bien dire que la vie du Christ d'Alice Guy est un véritable miracle. Qu'on prenne par exemple la scène du lavement des pieds du Christ par Marie-Madeleine. L'accent n'est pas mis simplement sur les actions ou l'action principale, mais il y a une série d'actions secondaires qui viennent faire respirer l'image. Qu'on remarque aussi l'éclairage. Un éclairage par étagement, lui aussi, comme le jeu en profondeur. L'action principale à l'avant-plan est dans une pénombre, alors que l'arrière-champ, derrière les murs, derrière les arcades, est éclairé beaucoup plus fortement. À l'époque du cinéma des premiers temps, on avait souvent recours à un bonimenteur ou conférencier qui, installé au bas de l'écran, commentait de vive voix et en direct les images et ce qui se passait à l'écran.
Judas Iscariot, having betrayed Jesus, arrives with a group of soldiers disguised as ordinary citizens in order to approach our Lord without arousing suspicion.
Et La Passion, c'est vous qui l'avez fait?
Oui.
Parce que je crois qu'il y a une erreur dans l'histoire du cinéma.
Oui, on a dit que c'était Jassé qui l'avait fait.
Qui était votre assistant?
Oui.
Grandmother has been completely and consistently ignored by most historians of the early days of cinema. Her works are often mentioned and frequently praised. But unfortunately, most reference books were compiled at a period when credit for her films, such as The Passion, was routinely given to others. Even people who never directed a film have been credited with Alice Guy's films.
For 11 years, Alice Guy was head of production at Gaumont. She supervised script preparation, set design, costumes. She oversaw the work of all of the company's film directors. In addition, she was herself a director and very often a scriptwriter. It is absolutely incredible that a man, Léon Gaumont, gave such enormous responsibilities to a woman 50 years before women had the right to vote in France. One reason for this, no doubt, is that he didn't realize, no more than anybody else, the phenomenal importance that cinema would have in only a few years. The fact that Guy was a woman, in my opinion, is partly responsible for her absence from many film histories. And yet it was she who, along with Ferdinand Zecca at Pathé, was one of the first heads of production in a major studio. It was she who set the Gaumont house style, for example, by using real locations in many of her films. It was she who trained the other pioneering filmmakers at Gaumont, such as Louis Fayard. For Guy, cinema was a process of exploration and discovery. She is one of the most important figures in the history of French cinema, and it is really sad that she is so little known today.
My grandmother, whom everyone called Mademoiselle Alice, had only one true love throughout those years, the cinema. Then at 33, she met the head of the Gaumont agency in Berlin, Guy-Blaché Bolton.
Nous avions le parlant, mais vous savez, le parlant, c'était extrêmement délicat parce que c'était les deux, l'appareil et la partie parlante, il fallait les accorder.
C'est ça.
Il fallait que ça soit absolument synchrone, n'est-ce pas? Et nos clients avaient quelquefois des difficultés. Alors Gaumont était ennuyé, il ne pouvait pas y aller. Il m'a dit, allez-y. Mais j'ai dit, mais je ne parle pas l'allemand, moi je ne connais pas l'Allemagne du tout. Il m'a dit, vous allez prendre Blaché avec vous, il vous servira de Cicérone. Et ce qui s'est fait, n'est-ce pas? Alors nous avons fait 15 jours, presque 3 semaines de visite parmi les gens pour leur expliquer comment c'était, pour essayer de mettre ça bien en train. Et
vous êtes marié?
Nous ne sommes pas mariés à ce moment-là, mais il m'a demandé. Je lui ai dit, écoutez, moi j'ai besoin de réflexion, j'avais pas très envie de quitter la France. Enfin, j'avais pas très envie d'épouser un Anglais, surtout. Les Anglais ne sont pas très sympathiques. Alors.
Though she was very open-minded and far ahead of her times in her work, she remained primly Victorian in other areas. In particular, she had a number of very fixed ideas, which, luckily, she was able to overcome.
J'ai dit à Gaumont, j'allais me marier, c'est une surprise. Alors il m'a dit, mais moi je vais vous en faire une autre, je vais vous envoyer en Amérique pour représenter le parlant. Parce qu'il avait déjà choisi Blaché pour aller représenter le parlant.
C'est ça. Alors vous êtes allé habiter?
Alors nous sommes allés en Amérique.
Alice wrote that she was leaving her family and her country with a heavy heart, convinced that she was giving up the work she loved forever. The America she found took a bit of getting used to. She didn't speak the language, she knew no one, and even the cinema was different from the one she knew. She wrote that in the United States, parlor kinetoscopes were all the rage. These devices had no projector. One viewer at a time watched an endless loop of film wind past a magnifying lens.
Gaumont est venu, il a arrangé les choses, il a acheté ce petit studio à Flashy, à Long Island, et il voulait faire du parlant, justement, du chant, etc. Et il en a chargé mon mari. Moi, j'ai aidé, mais enfin, je n'étais pas du tout son employé, heureusement, parce que sinon, je n'aurais pas pu commencer.
They stayed briefly in Cleveland and then moved to the town of Flushing near New York City. A few months later, switching from creation to procreation, grandmother gave birth to her first child, Simone. She settled down at home as a wife and mother, but it wasn't long before she felt the pull of the cinema. My Aunt Simone, or Simmy, was only 2 when grandmother went back to film production. On September 7th, 1910, she founded her own studio, Solax. Grandmother loved tearjerkers, sentimental stories like Falling Leaves, the tale of a little girl whose older sister is gravely ill. The heroine overhears the doctor telling her mother that by the time the trees have lost their leaves, the ailing child will be dead. Hoping to save her sister's life, the little girl slips out at night to tie the leaves back on the trees. Her first films in the United States were enormously successful, and when people learned that the head of Solax Films was a woman, grandmother became headline news. In 1912, she was the only woman in the U.S. earning over $25,000 a year, and the press felt she deserved every penny. Solax owes the success it has enjoyed since its early days entirely to one major asset, Madame Blaché's mastery of cinematic technique. The result has been excellent production standards, both photographically and artistically. The leading figure in the world of cinema could one day be a woman, and that woman will be Alice Blaché. Now rich and famous, happy with a husband she loved and a child she adored, grandmother, heavily pregnant in this photo, proceeded to expand both her studio and her family at once. The baby, my father Reginald, and the new premises both burst on the scene in 1912. At its new site, Solax would become the largest studio in the United States.
Nous avons acheté un terrain à Fort Lee, dans le New Jersey, qui était la grande cité du cinéma à l'époque.
Oui, Hollywood n'avait pas encore du tout de développement.
Ah non, du tout.
Tout se passait près de New York, oui, dans New Jersey.
Hollywood était encore une ville où sur les portes on mettait ni chien ni cinéaste.
This was before wartime energy restrictions pushed film studios west to the year-round sunshine of Hollywood. My grandmother was much loved by the people she worked with. She brought her children to the studio and ate with the crew. It was all one big happy family. She was admired not only for her charm, but also for her talent as a director and her expertise in the cinema. She was always willing to share technical knowledge she had acquired in Paris with American directors of photography. She was a mine of information in the cinematic world of the day.
Early film reviewers, early film commentators, they were lavish in their praise of Alice Guy-Blaché's artistic accomplishments. There seemed to be nothing she couldn't accomplish. After all, she'd built her own studio. So it was no big deal for her to have ditches dug, even to tame wild animals. There seemed to be no challenge that this extraordinary woman would not take up and would not succeed in accomplishing. Alice Guy-Blaché strived for increasingly more spectacular scenes, for more difficult stunts. She knew that was what the audiences wanted, was what the early reviewers appreciated in her films. It's very hard for us, a contemporary audience, to go back 80 or more years and to understand just how sophisticated these films appeared to audiences back then. We have to bear in mind there were no such animals as stunt people. The actors, the actresses, they did their own stunts. Or else they'd go to the circus, to circus performers, to daredevils, to perform any sort of special tricks that might be needed. Many of the early filmmakers, they used models. When Alice Guy-Blaché wanted to blow up a boat, she used a real boat. She didn't worry about the danger, and in fact, her husband, Herbert Blaché, was seriously injured in the explosion. We have to bear in mind that what today seems a cliché was not a cliché back then. Pioneers such as Alice Guy-Blaché, they were discovering cinema, they were discovering the potential of filmmaking. What they discovered, we now take for granted. We now use as part of the everyday process of filmmaking. Why, even the star system. That began back in the early years of this century when filmmakers such as Alice Guy-Blaché, they would hire a group of performers who would stay with them, and gradually their names, their faces became known, and they became stars.
Oh, j'ai eu des vedettes formidables. J'ai eu Petrova, par exemple. C'était une femme qui avait beaucoup de succès parce qu'elle est fort jolie, elle portait la toilette merveilleusement. C'est une femme de théâtre. Mais alors, c'était une femme... J'ai voulu lui faire une scène de jalousie un jour. Elle m'a dit, moi, madame, je ne fais jamais de scène de jalousie. Quand la jacinthe est finie, c'est moi qui la jette. Bon, alors.
One of the first major actresses created by the star system was Olga Petrova, very popular in the teens and 1920s, but totally forgotten today. She was almost unique in the film industry in that she was a feminist. She would only play strong women on screen, surgeons, doctors, intellectuals. Alice Guy-Blaché first directed Madame Petrova in 1915 in a film called The Tigress, and together the two women made 4 other films together. It must have been a formidable collaboration. I remember back in the mid-1970s when Alice Guy-Blaché's autobiography first appeared, Madame Petrova wrote me a fascinating letter about working with the director.
Since I didn't know anything about directing or directors, the question of the filmmaker's sex never occurred to me. If it had, I would have concluded that as shrewd a businessman as the producer Weber wouldn't risk investing in a neophyte like me if he wasn't sure of Madame Blaché's abilities. She never lost her dignity or calm during rehearsals and shooting. She had a velvet glove, but was capable of using an iron hand if necessary. Personally, I never saw her use it in the 4 films she directed me in. I never heard her shout into the megaphone. She obtained better results by getting her artists to obey and respect her.
J'ai eu le frère de Capellani qui était au français. Et j'avais mis dans mon studio des notes partout. Soyez naturels. C'est tout ce que je leur demandais. Alors il m'a dit, vous avez obtenu ça? Moi j'ai mis 10 ans pour être naturel au théâtre.
Be natural. You know, it seems such obvious advice today, but for film actors and actresses back in the teens, it was anything but. Back then, they posed for a motion picture, just as you'd pose for a still photograph. They were shot full body, and they pantomimed. But by telling her performers to be natural, Alice Guy was able to move in for close-ups. She was able to show body movement, expression. Be natural. With those 2 simple words, Alice Guy-Blaché transformed the art of screen acting for all time.
Mummy filled her scrapbooks with articles from the period, with criticisms, but she didn't really place much faith in critics. She preferred to mingle herself with the audience and to gather their impressions from what she heard. As for the articles about her, Mummy said they were often quite informative. She learned many details about her own beginnings, her background, her family, from the imaginations of her commentators. But really she hated falsehood, and she tried to correct everything herself. She would correct the people, and she would write in the margins of written work to correct things. If she were here, she'd have a good deal to say about me.
Academics became interested in Alice Guy-Blaché early on and invited her to give lectures. Having been the only woman filmmaker in the world for 17 years, she was something of a curiosity. Alice was in favor of women getting the vote. As early as 1912, she told a newspaper interviewer that women were ready for it. But having been raised as a member of the Victorian bourgeoisie, Alice certainly couldn't be a feminist the way we understand it today. But everything about her career, everything she did and said, affirmed that women were the equal of men. In 1914, Alice wrote in the film journal, Moving Picture World, "It has long been a source of wonder to me that many women have not seized upon the wonderful opportunities offered to them by the motion picture art to make their way to fame and fortune as producers of photodramas. Of all of the arts, there is probably none in which they can make such splendid use of talents, so much more natural to a woman than to a man, and so necessary to its perfection." She even made 2 feminist fables. Unfortunately, neither of them seems to have survived, but one can nevertheless detect in some of her films that have been conserved a different perspective on the world. One could even say a female perspective.
First World War, big conglomerates began buying up small film production companies, a move which was to influence the entire future of American cinema. Perhaps believing that grandfather would be better able to navigate through the minefields of fierce commercial rivalry, my grandparents made major changes in their lives. Grandfather left Gaumont and founded a new company, Blaché Features, and bit by bit, grandmother handed over the reins of power. However, grandfather's negotiating skills were no match for his rivals. The story goes that without consulting his wife, he practically gave away the rights to one of her films to a distributor who had convinced him it was worthless. This film, The Lure, was one of the biggest box office hits of its day. Grandmother said that it didn't take much to make a man question his wife's talent. After 1915, films, or photodramas as they were called, began to get longer. Grandmother directed what became known as feature-length films for a number of companies such as Popular Plays and Players, U.S. Amusement Corporation, and Paray Pictures. She loved sweeping melodramas, but her favorite films were love stories with a happy ending. Yet her own love story did not end happily. Liberated he may have been with regards to his wife's career, but in other respects, grandfather was a conformist. In his mid-40s, he took off for California with his leading lady, leaving wife and children behind. In an attempt to patch things up, Alice joined him briefly in Hollywood and even worked for him on 2 films. But the marriage was doomed. Life became professionally and personally intolerable beside a man whom she still loved, but whose affections had turned elsewhere. At the time of my grandparents' separation, independent companies throughout the United States were being bought up, and they received several tempting offers. However, they didn't approve of the way the big conglomerates operated. According to Alice, there was a lot of dishonesty and intimidation, so they turned down arrangements which might have proved extremely lucrative. In any event, working together became more and more difficult, and in the throes of a crumbling marriage, grandmother had no strength for battle on other fronts.
I found the record of the auction with what seem now quite pitiable little prices for things.
The auction of what?
The auction of her furnishings when she was obliged to sell her studio.
$2. The studio at Fort Lee was seized to cover back taxes that the new tenants had neglected to pay, and all my grandmother's possessions were auctioned. She watched her whole life being sold for a pittance and carted off.
C'est ça. Vous avez habité Hollywood aussi? Vous êtes allé à Los Angeles?
Oui.
Vers quelle époque?
À Hollywood. Oh mon Dieu, qu'est-ce que je suis allé à Hollywood? Je me rappelle vraiment pas très bien.
Hollywood was probably etched in grandmother's memory, but it's easy to understand why she would try to forget this dark period in her life. For it was in Hollywood that she lost her husband, her career, and most of her illusions. She wrote, "They say that America takes back whatever it gives you. Hopeless and penniless, I resolved to return to France with my children." She moved in with her sister and niece and tried on several occasions to get back into film. Though she was only 49, it was too late. France had forgotten all about her. So she focused all her attention on her children. My Aunt Simmy, whom I called Tante C, said that grandmother moved heaven and earth to raise her 2 children in some degree of comfort. She wrote children's stories and magazine articles under various masculine pen names.
Now, this is a story she wrote
I see.
in intention for children, promoting a mistaken myth that wolves will chase people in their sleigh, and you have to throw somebody out to distract the wolves.
She would only sign her own name to screenplays. Unfortunately, none of her scripts found a producer during the hard years between the wars in Europe, where money for film production was scarce, and opportunities for career women even scarcer. Later, Tante C got a job at the American Embassy and began to support her mother. Grandmother moved several times within Europe, to Belgium, Switzerland, and then back to France, wherever Simmy was posted. She began jotting down her memoirs and also began to search for her films.
Vous avez encore des films que vous avez tournés? Vous en possédez encore?
Malheureusement, on n'en retrouve pas.
On n'en retrouve pas.
On ne retrouve pas de films français. Mes films américains n'ont pas été donnés sous mon nom. Ils sont donnés sous le nom de la société qui les a. Alors, en arrivant, je vais les retrouver. Ça, j'en suis sûre.
My grandmother was 83. Traveling alone by plane, even taking the subway, held no terrors for her, especially when she was on the trail of her own cinematic past. She was one of the most prolific filmmakers in the early days of cinema. She had a hand in an estimated 700 films in France and the U.S. as director, scriptwriter, producer, or all three. She directed dramas and westerns and a slew of slapstick comedies before Max Sennett, Charlie Chaplin, and Buster Keaton, whose film debut was in one of Grandfather's films. She loved to experiment. She worked in almost every style, format, and genre.
J'ai fait des cow-boys, j'ai fait toutes sortes de choses. J'ai même appris à lancer le lasso.
Exhaustive research has found only a scant 50 films scattered all over the world. Unfortunately, Grandmother herself was unable to trace any of her American films and only found a few from her days at Gaumont. What does remain in America is a branch of her family. My father, Reggie, my mother, and I lived in the States. Grandmother didn't like our being so far away. She wanted to bring the family together again. Despite repeated efforts, She was also unable to find a publisher for her autobiography during her lifetime. The book came out a few years after her death.
She tried to publish it as what it in fact is, simply a few memories from the earliest part of her life, with a few sketches of the later part, just barely indicated. She tried to publish this, and she was rejected over and over.
I kind of remember
Yes.
Simi saying that, being quite angry
Oh,
that
they were quite cruel,
that they
yes.
hadn't published it, and it was so long.
There were so
coming.
many of the publishers. Mommy, was not really used to dealing with publishers, book publishers, although she had published a good deal in magazines. Many of them would lead her on and pretend to be considering this very carefully, and then ask her for a lot of money.
Oh.
And,
to try
yes.
In order to publish it, they
Well,
asked her
yes,
for money?
a vanity publication
Oh,
it would
yeah.
have been. And she was too proud for that.
Right.
And so she would try somebody else. And this happened really several times, and unfortunately it would take a long time each time while the little show went on between the publisher and poor Mummy waiting in
Right.
the wings,
Victor Bashi, who recently wrote a book on my grandmother and who met with her over a number of years, said that despite all the troubles she'd endured, she was not in the least bitter. The only title she claimed was that of the first woman filmmaker in the world, a title no one could dispute. After all, she was the only woman filmmaker for 17 years, but one which she was forced to defend more than once on both sides of the Atlantic. Grandmother and Tansi came back to the States for good in 1964. After suffering a series of strokes, Grandmother died in a nursing home on March 24, 1968, at the age of 95. Till then, her mind had been sharp, but after the strokes, she couldn't remember her own name, much less her life as a filmmaker. She had joined in the collective amnesia that shrouded her life and work for so many years.
Having lived with her all my life, I would like to add a personal note. Mother was passionate and generous in nature, endowed with exceptional energy and youthfulness. She was open-minded and always interested in scientific or literary discoveries. Her profound love of nature and enthusiasm for life were contagious. She was more a friend to me than a mother, and I owe her most of the happiness I have left.
Nothing is left of what she built in Fort Lee. No monument bears her name. A humble plaque in this sad memorial garden is all that marks her passage on this earth.